Perfect, thank you.
Okay, we're good.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Jones. I serve as chair of the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask members of this advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. I see we have a couple people joining here, so we'll have a full house. Jim Kilmartin.
Present.
Jerdine Coleman.
Here.
Nicole Eitzen. I see her there. She may not have her audio on yet. John Fleeker.
Here.
James Godby.
Here.
Chris Haben.
Here.
And Marcy Lechtenberg.
Present here.
I note that the following BSRB members are also present: David Fye
Here.
and Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye, I'll read a message about this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On July 6, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals that requested notice of advisory committee meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material for the meeting have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I did check it before we started the meeting, and there is no one currently on the conference call line.
Okay, thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see everyone on the meeting today. Our first item of business is agenda approval. You received a packet of information, and one of those pieces is our agenda. Are there any comments, suggestions, additions to the agenda? If not, I'll accept a motion to approve.
So moved.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Okay, thank you. The next item of business is approval of the minutes. Also attached in your packet, the draft minutes from June 23. You take a minute to look at those, please. And then if there's not any other comments or suggestions, I'll take a motion to approve.
I'll approve.
Thank you,
Second.
Jim. Is there a second? Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jims. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Okay, great. David, I'll hand it over to you for the executive director's report.
All right, thank you, Mary. Just a few notes on operations to begin with. First, all state agencies are required to submit annual reports as part of the overall state auditing process. This has to do with something called GASB, if you're familiar with that process. But on behalf of the agency, I've been putting together those annual reports, and those were submitted prior to the deadline. There were about 15 different reports that involved reviewing a number of our different operations, and so those were all submitted. And so that is something that has been completed. Additionally, each year, the governor's office asks us to revise a 3-year IT plan with representatives from the Office of Information Technology Services. Some of this has to do with short-term goals and long-term goals. Just for reference, last year, a couple of the items that were on that list We're trying to get a better camera for the boardroom to have hybrid meetings, and then also looking at changing some of our current technology to make it to replace it with newer technology. And I'm happy to report that we do have a new camera based on the Spark funding that we received. So that has been taken care of. That is off of our list. We are in the process of switching over some of our existing desktop computers with laptops, and so that's in the process. We've been on a 3-year cycle where we're trying to move about 1/3 of our staff to the new state desktop as a service program, and so we're moving forward on that. Additionally, our long-term goals, we would like to have electronic records here in the office instead of paper records. We'd also like to move more towards having electronic resources for applicants to be able to apply for licensure. And so those are on our list. We're still working on some of those topics, but we did submit that, and I expect that there will be probably a report or a publication put out sometime in the next month that lists all agencies' 3-year IT plans. So I just want to make you aware of that coming up on the radar. In terms of other items, in terms of annual items, each beginning of the fiscal year, certain licensing agencies are required to submit information that corresponds to a bill that passed during the 2021 legislative session. That bill is known as House Bill 2066. And while it amended existing statute, the specific items that were added in that bill from 2021 created new law that called for a report to be made beginning last September and then each year after that. And so we're currently in the process of pulling information for individuals who qualified for reciprocity, and we were able to license through the changes that were put into that bill. And some of that has to do with the timeline for licensure. Some of it has to do if we were not able to license someone, the reasons why we couldn't meet the timeframes listed in that bill. So we're in the process of putting that report together. And then last year, once those were all collected by the members of the Legislative Research Department, then they put out a publication for that report. So we will be submitting that information by September 1st, and I will let you know if I see a copy of that report for all agencies. I can tell you that based on what we submitted last year, our numbers were in compliance with what the bill had, and I believe our numbers were pretty good compared to the ranges that we were asked to perform in for those applicants. There were about, I think, around 200 individuals who qualified for reciprocity under that change to law. In terms of some other items, I mentioned we are in the process of hopefully moving towards converting our existing paper records to electronic records. That is not an easy process or a quick process, but I think it'll be something really beneficial here for the office. Part of that is that we have, every state agency has a document retention schedule that's on file with the state. For many years, our document retention schedule has been for us to essentially have paper records until both licensing records and disciplinary records, but our primary records are licensing. And for the licensing, we are to hold those until someone's license expires plus 10 years. And we are trying to move paper records out of the office and transfer them to the Historical Society for archiving purposes. And so we made a request last month to the State Records Review Board to see if we could shorten that time frame from expiration plus 10 years to expiration plus 2 years. And that doesn't mean the documents are destroyed after that point. They just move to archiving. But we made that request, and I answered questions from that committee, and they did approve our request. And so that has now been modified, and we're in the process of collecting about 8 years of licensing records that we can transfer from our office to the Historical Society. The reason I bring that part up is because when we were evaluating being able to convert paper to electronic, we were looking at how many records we would actually need to be able to convert. And it made sense in our minds to go ahead and reduce the amount of paper first. And then once we had reduced that amount of paper, then to look at converting our existing records into electronic. And so just making sure those things fall in the right order. There is a committee that meets next month, and I'm hoping to talk to them and get a little bit more details about how we can put a plan in place to make sure we have good backups and archiving of the electronic records, and then make sure we have a good plan to convert those records to electronic. So that's in the process. I can't give you a real firm time frame on that, but that will really help us here in the office once we get to that model. Another item that has to do with an annual responsibility for the agency, every September 15th, all state agencies have to submit a budget to the legislature. It actually goes to the Division of Budget first, and the governor's office reviews the agency's request. Last year, the legislature approved revisions to fiscal year 2023, and we made a budget request for fiscal year 2024 and 2025. This year, they are looking at any revisions to fiscal year 2024 and then any revisions to the approved fiscal year 2025. So once that system opens up, we'll have about a month to put the numbers in, do those calculations, and then I can make a report to the board in terms of any kind of changes in expenditures or any kind of increases, or they're called supplementals if we're requesting additional funding authority. And just kind of as a reminder, the legislature does not provide any funding to us for operation. We are financed by the fees that we collect primarily for licensure, and by statute, we give 10% of all the revenue we collect to the state, which assists with operations of the state. However, the legislature sets a limit on how much we can spend from our existing fee fund. And so that limitation really guides what we're able to do on a year-to-year basis. So we will submit that by the September 15th deadline. Additionally, these reports, I try to give you some updates from the most recent board meeting. The board met on July 10th, 2023. Some of the items the board discussed at that meeting include new board members on the board. David Stevens is a new board member. He holds the public member spot previously held by John Norton. Additionally, Linda Heitzman Powell is a new board member for licensed psychology. She had previously been a member of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee because she is licensed as both a licensed psychologist and a behavior analyst. But Rick Steele was not seeking reappointment after the end of his first term. And so Linda applied for that position and the governor appointed her. So she will be serving as a member of the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee and as a board member for licensed psychology. And also at that board meeting, she accepted the appointment to become the new chair of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee. As we talked about last year, there is not a board member specifically named in statute for the behavior analyst profession. And there were questions about, could we have a behavior analyst on the board? And we always said hypothetically that yes, if there is a board member who holds that license, there would be a behavior analyst on the board. So while there's not one specifically in statute, now there is a behavior analyst sitting on the board who can talk to the licensed psychology profession and also the behavior analyst profession. Some other items from that board meeting on July 10th. There are some proposed changes to regulations that are out currently for public comment. This past legislative session, we talked a lot about a bill the board had put forward and a number of changes that occurred to that bill. The final version of that bill was sub for Senate Bill 131. And consistent with that bill, there are a number of new license types that would be created by the BSRB. And so to make sure that we have the specific fees to be able to charge for those new license types, we need to set those amounts in regulation. And so there is a regulation that is currently open for public comment until, I believe, October 3rd. And so it is posted on the BSRB website. You can review all the proposed changes. Those changes are primarily the fees that I just referenced. There is going to be a public meeting at the BSRB board office that is going to be on October 3rd from 10 a.m. until 11 a.m. And so notice of that was also posted in the Secretary of State's publication, the Kansas Register. And so that's kind of the movement with those regulations. But once that time runs, if there's any comments back to the board, we will let them know about any feedback we received. And then the board will have the option to finalize those recommendations as permanent recommendations, a regulation. And then after that, they would need to be published in the Secretary of State's publication in full. And then I believe about 10 days later, they take effect, and then they would be permanent regulations. So we are moving on that process. Additionally, let's see. So in terms of those fees, most of those do have to do with the bill. There were a handful of other fees earlier this spring. The board did vote to reduce certain fees for the temporary licenses. It would reduce fees for a number of professions to make all of the temporary license fees $50. And so I know for your profession, that's a decreased significant amount for the temporary license. So I did want to compliment the board for their reducing that fee for the temporary license. Additionally, there are some new fees that are being set. One is a fee for individuals who are practicing under a psychology multi-state compact known as PsyPAC. Every year, the state of Kansas, the BSRB specifically, is charged an assessment for people practicing under that compact. And so when the statute was passed, the board had authority to set a fee for people practicing under that compact who have a home state license here in Kansas. And so once those fees are set, then we will be able to charge that upon renewal if somebody is practicing under SIPAC authority. Another one is to set a fee to become a board-approved supervisor for the professions of professional counseling and marriage and family therapy. That is not for people who are already board-approved supervisors. It is an application fee for those that are seeking that from the beginning. So if some people are already board-approved supervisors, it would not involve them. But for individuals who are seeking that, it's a small $20 fee, and that's mainly to make sure that we have funding to compensate the use of staff time to review those and approve those. In terms of some other updates, there's a number of annual meetings for the different professions that will be taking place here in the next few months. I will be attending a meeting for the psychology profession at the end of September. I'll also be attending a meeting for the Social Work Association at the end of the year as well. But I want to let you know that Mary Jones and I will be attending a conference for the Association of Marital and Family Therapy Regulation Board, and that will be on September 26th and 27th in Salt Lake City, Utah. It's the first time that I have attended that conference, but I would have liked to go to it in previous years. That always lined up right at the time that we had to submit our budget. And so this year it was a little bit later, which was helpful. And so Mary and I are going to be attending that meeting and bringing back information to share with all of you and the board. Some of the topics that are going to be discussed at that meeting, the big focus really has to do with regulatory trends. And there's a number of subcategories. One has to do with pathways to licensure across jurisdictions, mobility models for the marriage and family therapy workforce. There's also some information that's going to be provided as far as state delegate panels or different things that are going on in other states. There's going to be some information that's going to have to do with implications for regulators, regulating emerging technology, artificial intelligence and social media regulation, information on DEI, information on the Marriage and Family National Exam. And there will also be some information on postgraduate supervised experience hours and competencies for independent practice. So lots of good topics. They're also going to cover some quality assurance, complaints, and discipline. So they should cover the full gamut, it looks like. And so we'll be taking notes and bringing back information from that conference. Additionally, just some other items to put on your radar the board is looking at and working on. The board is in support of putting out an RFP to create an impaired provider program for the profession. It is something that some of the other agencies in the state have for some of their licensees. Other states use programs like this as an alternate for a disciplinary remedy. If individuals are struggling with mental health care or with substance abuse. And so that is something that, to my knowledge, the BSRB has never had specific for this agency, but the board is supportive of gathering information and putting out an RFP to see what entities are able to provide as far as services for the board. So I'll keep you updated as we continue to work through that topic. Additionally, the board is putting together a basic outline for a license expedited application review process. This was something that was newly added in the bill that passed this past spring. There was not a model that was an example for the agency to follow. There was some very general language for the board to put together and to create an expedited license review process. And so I've talked with my staff here to get some feedback on what we think would be helpful to fit that model or to put something together that would be helpful for individuals. And so we had provided some comments back to the board. The board has had discussion on that item, and we're going to try to provide some basically draft regulatory language back to the board so they can really review that again, and then maybe finalize some of those details so we can get that submitted through the regulation process. But that is something probably we can be looking for maybe at the end of this calendar year or sometime next year, based on how quickly the regulation review process takes place, and based on the board's discussion too, if we need to dig deeper into any of those topics. Additionally, the board always seeks to have an annual meeting that's in person. It's an offsite meeting for planning purposes to look at legislative items or the board's agenda for different topics, in-depth topics that can be discussed are good topics for that meeting too. This year, that meeting will be offsite. It will be on Monday, October 23rd, 2023, from 9 a.m. until 4 p.m. in Wichita. It will be at the Seasons venue at Watson Park, and we'll be posting some information on the BSRB website. Even though it's not here in Topeka, it is an open meeting, so any individuals from the public are welcome to attend if they wish to do so. But that meeting should go from about 9 a.m. and then end around 4 p.m. In terms of just a couple of other updates. So I think for this committee, I did want to highlight that there are a couple of legislative meetings that are coming up. And in general, I try to keep the board updated of different items during the legislative session, but during the legislative interims, the committees don't meet as frequently, or they get approved to meet for specific topics. And so this year, I mentioned we're going through the regulation process for those fees. There is a meeting called the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations, JCAR, and that meeting is going to be on Monday, August 21st, 2023 at the Capitol. It begins at 10 a.m. in room 582 North. Leslie Allen and I will be attending that meeting, and I'll be presenting information on the different fees that are in our proposed regulations, and then answering any questions from members of the legislature. Additionally, there is a special committee on mental health that was approved to meet for up to 3 days this fall, and that committee is going to be meeting on Wednesday, August 23rd, 2023 at 9 a.m. in room 112 in the Capitol, and also Thursday, August 24th at 9 a.m. in 112 in the Capitol. And just some of the topics that they have put out in a preliminary summary for the agenda for those meetings. They're going to be looking to receive information on mental health intervention teams, federally qualified health centers, and certified community behavioral health clinics. And there will be a roundtable for stakeholders on that first day. And then the second day, there's going to be a presentation on the 988 National Suicide Prevention Hotline, youth suicide prevention research, telehealth, presentations and agency updates from recommendations back at the 2020 Special Committee on Mental Health Modernization and Reform, and also committee comments and recommendations. And just to let you know, the legislature does have a YouTube channel similar to how we broadcast our meetings. And so if you are interested in seeking to watch any of those meetings, they should be streamed live, or they're available after those meetings on the legislative YouTube channel. And I would note too, on the YouTube channel, there is a placeholder reserved for the Mental Health Committee to meet on Friday, August 25th, 2023. That meeting is not listed on the specific interim calendar of legislative meetings. So I'm not sure if that is just being held in case their work runs long, or if there might be a few further updates. But as of right now, they're looking at meeting Wednesday, August 23rd and Thursday, August 24th. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and answer any questions.
David, I know there's a lot of information that you're always providing us. Were there any questions or thoughts?
Can you share again the conference you're going to? I'm just kind of curious to look at it, and it's one I hadn't heard of before, and I didn't get it written down where it was at.
Sure. So this is an annual conference. It's hosted by a group that's called the Association of Marital and Family Therapy Regulatory Board. I think their acronym they go by is AMFTRB. And this
Which
is a
should
group,
sound familiar to you, Nicole.
Yes. Yeah.
and they meet. I believe they meet annually. The problem is that some of their past meetings have been right around that September 15th date, and so it's right when the budget is submitted. So this is the first opportunity that I have to go to that conference. It'll be in Salt Lake City, Utah. And so that's where they're meeting, and they have put out, I'm not even sure this is a finalized agenda. It still says proposed on the draft that I have, but that is the basic outline of the topics they're planning to cover. We, at the composite board, we have different associations that we work with for different purposes. And I'm familiar with going to some of the social work conferences and some of the psychology conferences. And when I first started, I was invited to attend one of the in-state master's level psychology conferences. But as I'm kind of growing in my role now that I've been here for about 2.5 years, I'd like to continue to stretch out and attend more of these conferences for the other professions too, and really learn more about each of the differences for the different professions too, and be able to bring that back. The board can be working on things in lots of different areas all at once.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah, I'm super grateful for the opportunity that David's provided for me to go along, especially because so many of the topics we have been discussing as well, and it'll be exciting to bring back some of the information from across the nation. So I'm very, very glad to be part of that.
Well, and Mary, I appreciate you going, and I definitely appreciate how involved the board members are getting. Laura Shaughnessy has gone to recently to the National Board for Certified Counselors Conference, and Richard Nobles and Linda Heisman Powell will be attending the psychology conference at the end of the year, and you're attending this conference with me. And so it's great to see so many board members getting invested, and we can bring back so much. And I really feel like, when I get the opportunity to talk at conferences, I feel like a lot of people are looking at Kansas and seeing what we're doing and our success stories. And it's really nice for me to be able to talk to other states and answer questions. And so when they're dealing with issues, they can kind of ask us, how have we approached these topics? And so I know we're all working on different things and we can all learn from each other, but it's good. So Mary, I appreciate you going to that conference.
Any other questions or comments from David's report? Okay, well, we will move on to the next agenda item, which was discussion about adding new members to the advisory committee. David, I don't know if you'd like to kick off this conversation for us.
Sure. So as you might recall earlier this year, and just to kind of frame it, advisory committee members serve 2-year terms, and you can be reappointed up to 4 terms. And so as long as those terms are staggered, you're going to see some movement coming off the advisory committee and new members coming on. 2 meetings ago, I think there was a request made for me to reach out to members of the profession to see if anyone is interested in applying for different positions and to collect the letters of interest and resumes or CVs from them, and to be able to bring that back to you so you could review those applicants and then make recommendations on members to be added to your advisory committee. And as part of the advisory committee policy, which is in your packet, it does talk about some of the different items to consider when reviewing materials for applicants, specifically from the advisory committee. For that selection item in the advisory committee policy, it talks about in reviewing nominations, the committee should work to ensure there is diverse representation, including but not limited to geographic setting, gender, culture, and ethnicity. And members should provide representation of the levels of licensing for that discipline, and those members should be selected from among public and private practitioners and educators. And so when I initially sent out the message to licensees, I did highlight the information from the advisory committee policy, and I attached a copy of the policy, and then individuals sent in what they chose to send in their letters of interest and CVs. And at the last meeting, I believe that there was some interest in the members of the advisory committee and looking to see if we could have a follow-up request sent to those applicants, maybe to ask additional questions and to collect additional input from them on some of those factors that I discussed or other items that they might think would be relevant to the committee. But in dealing with topics that deal with diversity factors, the advisory committee asked me to speak with legal counsel to see kind of what was appropriate to be asked in this context and how we could proceed. And so since that advisory committee meeting, the board did enter an agreement with new legal counsel. And so we are now receiving legal services through Friedman and Forbes. And I did speak with the attorney for that agency and kind of relayed the information, provided the advisory committee policy, and he really did an in-depth review and provided some good feedback to me. And Mary and I had a conversation about that too. I think there've been a number of different items that make requesting further information a little complicated at the moment. There's been a big court case recently that talked about evaluation of different diversity factors when it came to things like college admissions. And there's been some comments in terms of certain state offices in terms of opinions on this topic and how these factors should be weighed and what can and can't be requested or asked about. And so after looking into all that information and following up, I think at the moment, the best approach is probably to go ahead and use the information that had been provided. The advisory committee does allow the policy does allow the advisory committee to consider all those factors. But I think having targeted questions that might be seeking more detailed information on those topics might run into issues that could be potentially problematic. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to obtain any additional information. But in terms of your review of these applicants, there's nothing that says specifically how you need to weigh one candidate over another, except that it does kind of give some guidance on what factors to look for. So I apologize, I don't have any additional information for you from the last conversation, but I just kind of wanted you to know that I did look into that, had some conversations, did additional research, And that's kind of how we got to the point to where we are today.
Yeah, thank you for that. In our previous discussions, we can certainly add 1, 2, or if we like the applicants for this, and then add some more next year so we can continue to keep staggered terms. So at this point, I would just open it up for discussion among the committee members if there are resumes or applicants that we'd like to consider moving forward with. And I think geographically, Jardine, are you the farthest west in Kansas right now? Or is that Nicole?
I think technically Nicole, right?
Geography's hard. I'm in Hutch, and so.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Jardine's farther.
Yeah.
If you're not
like
kind of
a
west,
few
yeah,
degrees west of me. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
I was like, it's like quite barely.
Jim was farther out, and now he's relocated into the Wichita area.
Oh,
Correct.
okay.
Yeah, Jim and I were out there, Western Kansas area, but
Yeah.
we're both Wichita. Although I practice in Winfield, which is south of Wichita. So
Well, that's true, but I do the whole state, so
yeah, that's true.
Hey, any of the applicants stand out for this group?
I think there was a question on the one that was from Hayes,
Uh-huh.
as far as and I think there was a question on age, or that she was that the one that was retired, I believe.
That might have been.
I
let
thought
me
we were
pull
more
that.
curious about, her current practice, like what
Mhm.
she would be able to help with in regards to current practice and,
Yeah,
Well-
she is retired.
Well, the other thing that I did notice in looking at the resumes, that as far as experience, there were, I think, a couple of them that did practice west of 281 highway. But I think that Diane Sable, I think that she did do Iroquois Center in Garden City or in Greensburg for a while. But I think as far as today, as far as where they are, most of them are Wichita or west.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought there was one in Gardner, and again, of course, that's not our only, and then one in Overland Park. And the Overland Park candidate has a lot of experience in the field in different settings. Definitely has impressive background from that perspective.
I do wonder with the one from Hayes, I do know that she's retired, but she also, she's got some great experience with teaching and evaluation and some of those things, and would be able to hopefully give a perspective on the landscape in Western Kansas that is very different than other parts of Kansas where there are less resources. So I would be curious, what she would be able to offer as far as, inside experience, that kind of stuff.
Well, the other thing was, I'm curious about, and I know some statistics as far as social workers, but when you're looking at, say, Wichita, Manhattan, and going east is a lot different amount of practice than going west. And so how many people do we actually have a possibility of even looking at as far as the ratio between those two? So there's less people that we maybe even that could apply.
That's fair. Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you work that out as far as, so.
Some of what I've heard, and I don't know if this is relevant to this, but and I know that like part of our discussion that we've had is in regards to supervision and would we be open to maybe exceptions? I know that that's a policy that we've talked about, and I think it's on the agenda again today. Some of what I've heard from people is sometimes they will leave places where it's really hard for them to get that supervision to be in spaces that they can. Now, telehealth or televideo has made it a lot easier to do some of that, which is really nice. But I had somebody that transferred from a mental health center that was more in eastern or in western Kansas here. And not that it was the deciding factor, but part of it was that none of her time at that mental health center, none of that supervision counted towards her hours. And so, yeah, I don't know if that could be impacting representation of MFTs is because of that, the struggle for the supervision and getting some of that. I don't know. I'm really speculating. That's not based on any facts. It's more just stories that I've heard from people. And so, and I don't know if that can or will change, but yeah. And what our hope is, do we hope for that to our profession to spread more, or what would that look like?
As a public member of the group, I thank you all for being here. I don't have any specific experience in what you do, but I'm wondering if from an advisory committee perspective, is it best to consider someone that might be current and up to date on practicing today and going forward, as opposed to geographical needs? In other words, I believe all of you being professionals would want the same standards and professional requirements and futures, no matter if you lived in Overland Park or Garden City. And so I don't have a voice really. I have a voice, but I'm not going to use it in determining whom you select. But I don't know that geography should make a difference, at least from my perspective, on how that person might help this group move forward with advising how your profession should proceed forward. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Jim. I think go ahead, Jardine.
I was just going to say, in a similar vein, I would love to focus on the applicants that are doing clinical work. I think we have a lot of administrative folks on the committee right now who are doing part-time clinical work. No shade, but we are. And so it would be nice to have some just representation of people doing work, just as part of their full-time experience. Because I think that's who we're making regulations for, is the people that are doing this stuff full-time. So that's kind of just a lens I'm looking through applicants with.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point too. I think thinking about practicing now is helpful to a lot of the discussions we're having, and maybe those that aren't in other diverted with other things too administratively makes sense as well. So is anyone willing to, or wanting to make a recommendation of any of the candidates that we have?
I'd like to recommend Heidi Vila.
Okay, discussion. Any discussion from the advisory members? It sort of meets the last 2 points that were made in other comments here.
Yes, and that was the reason I put forth on it's full time. Yep.
I think there might be people who know her in this call. I don't know. I don't know if that's the case or not, or if that's a comfortable recommendation or discussion because of what might be an employment relationship or something like that. So I don't know. Or at least a knowledge base. I don't want to make any inferences there that don't exist. So
we were previous coworkers, but she's currently in private practice in Manhattan. She's a really close personal friend, so I don't feel comfortable saying anything about it.
okay. Thank you very much, Judy. These discussions can sometimes border an awkward line, so I appreciate that. I think given some of the comments that were just made, I would be comfortable making a second to Marcy's recommendation on this advisory committee member. Any other discussion?
I support that too.
I'll move to a vote then. All those in favor of adding Heidi Vella to the MFT Advisory Committee, please signal by saying aye.
Aye.
And any opposed, please say same sign.
I'd like just to go down as an abstention. As long as
Jardine,
my
are you
votes,
abstaining also?
Oh, can I abstain?
You can.
I would do that.
And Jim, your abstention is,
as long as my vote's not necessary, I would abstain.
okay. Does that work for us, Dave?
Yes, that should be
We have a
fine.
majority. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you very much. That motion carries. We'll make a recommendation that Heidi be appointed to serve on this committee. At this point, do we want to go with another recommendation, or do we want to pause with one member? I think we were initially thinking maybe adding two, but we don't have to. That's the thing. We're not short on members, so we can always have the flexibility to come back at this at another time.
I think somebody else that had stuck out to me, but I'm a little unsure if she's practicing in Kansas. I mean, she lives in Lee Summit, Missouri, so I mean that is so close. But with Sharon Loddick, and that stuck out to me. She is practicing, but also does some co-occurring with substance use, and I think that is a really helpful perspective to have. I'm assuming she applied. Well, I mean, she'd have to be licensed here to be eligible, and so I'm guessing her practice is in Kansas. But
Yeah, I don't think that's really clear.
The metro area.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, her resume says her present is in Compass Health in Missouri, or Compass Health of Missouri.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
why I wasn't looking at that, because I
Yeah.
was perceiving maybe she was not working in the state.
I
Her
wasn't
letter, she wrote that she has a private practice in the metro area, serves Kansas clients.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if Psych Renovations, where that was at.
I also think Jessica might be a good addition. I know we decided that we weren't
Pretty Wichita heavy.
maybe considering geographic location, but yeah, she definitely is a practitioner full time, it seems like, based on her resume.
Okay, is anyone wanting to put forth a motion for another recommendation? Or do we want to hold at this point?
I'll put
Sorry?
forth the motion that we hold at this point, since I'm not hearing anybody else have any strong feelings.
I would second that.
Okay.
I think one of the things that I want to make comment on is that, you know, with the whole thing with the selection and what we're looking at, I think it's going to be very difficult to try and cover 9 out of 10 of those, or even more, you know, as far as areas. And I think that what Jim brought forward as far as the whole thing of looking at people that are practicing, you know, would be I think trying to prioritize those things, but I'm still not giving up on geographic area. So
I think that's why it was written as such, right? That advisory committee members are representative of the field, and that includes geographic region. And I appreciate everyone sort of keeping an eye on what we can know and try to give enough depth and for this committee to be cognizant of all those matters. So I think it's good discussion, and I'm glad that we can have that discussion and make sure that we get good advisory members, because we do a lot of great work. So unless there's an objection to that, we'll pause with the one recommendation, and then we can always bring this back at a later time as well. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Excellent. Okay, we are going to move to item B, which is continued discussion on possible changes to requirements for clinical training plans. Dave, I don't know if that's you or Leslie going to help us with that conversation.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and open that one up. So there's a few items that are on old business that you did discuss at your previous meeting. And so if you want, in your copy of the minutes from that July 23rd meeting, it has some information about some of the comments that you had last meeting, some of the consensus for changes. But since I believe that was your first opportunity to discuss some of those items, and I know sometimes for me, when I think about an item and then I leave, my mind continues to work and I keep having thoughts. And I said, oh, well, if we had one more opportunity, one more bite at that apple, maybe I would have added more things. And so I wanted to give you one more opportunity on some of these to share some additional feedback. But in the copy of the draft minutes, this is item number 5B. And so basically on that copy of that regulation, it's 102-5-7A. And these have to do with some of the professional postgraduate supervised experience requirements for clinical marriage and family therapists. At the last meeting, what the advisory committee was asked to focus on specifically was item H. And that item basically calls, it highlights a requirement that all changes to clinical supervision training plans shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. The changes shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the changes took effect. And if the supervisee fails to submit the changes to the board within 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan were approved by the board. And last meeting, you talked about that item. There was some support from the advisory committee to provide more flexibility, that instead of saying hours shall not count, it would say that hours may not count, which will allow the board the opportunity to review those cases when there was a question about hours not being or changes not being reported. There was also some support for keeping the 45-day requirement in there. And I think that is probably, I think the original reason why that was put in is to make sure that people weren't spending time doing hours that would not be approved as part of a training plan. So having that 45-day requirement, I think keeping that in there is keeping people mindful that you do need to report back to make sure that we can verify those hours are still in line with what you had approved for the original training plan or what we can approve for hours. There was also some comments from the advisory committee as far as recommending changing language instead of all changes to be submitted. It said substantial changes are to be submitted rather than any change. And then the advisory committee was also supportive of highlighting specific changes that would need to be reported using some language that would say including but not limited to, and then listing things like changes in supervisor, changes in work site, substantial changes in job description and responsibilities or scope of work. So that's where you were at the last meeting. But if you have any additional thoughts or other recommended changes, we could go ahead and add those now.
Go ahead, Chris.
Does changing the language to increase flexibility, while very positively intended and one that I totally can understand, does that create a problem for staff if you're reviewing those kinds of issues? Because sometimes it can be more helpful in certain situations to say this is the rule that if you have to defend a decision to say, I didn't make the rule, this is the rule, and we have to, in other words, by creating flexibility for you, does that create more problem? I'm wondering if an intended help makes things harder, is all I'm asking.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. Leslie, do you want to weigh in on that?
I think Joan reviews all the training plans. I would say yes, Joan definitely agrees with that. It will create more. She feels she was comfortable with all means all. And but then if other people are getting approved by the board because of certain circumstances, that we don't want that either. The biggest thing is that the staff isn't going to make these. These are all going to have to go to the board. Right. Staff won't make determine what those are.
Well, and I think I might have shared this last time, but if not, I've asked questions about this specific rule at some of the National Association meetings, just to kind of see, is this a common standard for other states? And when I share this item with other states, the response I get are people really big eyes. They're surprised that we have a rule like that would disqualify all those hours. And so I think we are a little out of line with the common trend in different states. I think there's not a lot of uniformity in supervision, unfortunately, which is one of the problems. But I think right now it's a very strict rule, and it is helpful for us to be able to enforce when we have that strict rule. The problem, though, is that it does have really significant consequences. I think if this was opened up, it probably would not make us quite the outlier that we are right now, as it appears. And it would add probably a little bit of lack of clarity initially, but I think the ultimate goal is that we want people to be doing the hours and doing the hours in the right way. And right now, I think if someone were to challenge the decision, it would still need to go in front of the board, and then board would have the opportunity to basically say, we're denying those hours, and potentially we're denying this person for license. And so this does give the board more tools to be able to evaluate those and taking more things into consideration. So it will make it a little bit, I think, more unclear initially, but I think the hopeful benefit will be that it will be empowering the board to be able to weigh these factors when these matters do come up, instead of saying that these applicants will lose all those hours automatically.
Very helpful. I was worried that an intent to be helpful, it would create actually a problem, because I've been in situations where having clarity about a line is really important. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and if this was a common standard between all the different states, and this would make us out of compliance with that, I would share that too. But I feel like this was the really powerful rule to get people to make sure that they were doing things consistently. And so it will probably create a little bit of confusion if it does change. But I think the end result hopefully will be that more things can be considered under kind of the general fairness type lens. And so that if people didn't meet this requirement to the letter of the law, the board would still be able to evaluate if those hours should count, if they're still in compliance with what we were able to count hours for. That's the hope.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate, I know it's been really heartbreaking for the board to have to disqualify hours because of these types of things, when we know that the work was substantially similar to what was originally in a training plan. But I appreciate those comments so much, because there's sometimes the opportunity for unintended problems as a result of that. Leslie, from your perspective, changing this language will give Joan mostly clarity on being able to proceed.
I don't know.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I guess one of the things I'm struggling with when I listen to all the committees is, you say a similar scope of practice. So if someone goes from one mental health center to another, if it's a similar scope of practice, do they lose those hours because it was a different work site? So, and I think part of it is, it's what the board wants. So the board's going to have to give real clear, in the beginning at least, real clear instructions, and we the thing that is being consistent is the biggest thing that we worry about, is consistency for all the applicants.
I can see where, Leslie, this will, for Joan at least, will create some initial confusion to her, because she's going to try to measure in her own mind what the board's going to do if I bring it down the hall, or should I bring it down the hall. But
Right.
I think ultimately I agree that the board really doesn't want to be as strict and wants to take some human side to what happens in people's daily lives these days. And by changing this, I think it gives us the flexibility, and I think it'll even out for the staff in the office eventually. But if it doesn't, I think then that we need to hear about that too as a board.
Well, and I think we talked about this last time. Each of the advisory committees is discussing this, but I think when the board does take action, I think as much as possible, the board will want to have uniform language between the different professions, which should help with some of the clarity. And I think including that, including but not limited to, and then highlighting specific examples, that should be a nice way for us to point to specific items when there are questions about some of those things. There will still be some question, I'm sure, about items that are not specifically listed in the regulation. But I know right now, with no items specifically listed, just saying all changes, there's also some confusion about what really is a true change. You know, we talked, I think, last meeting about if somebody changes from office number 10 to office number 11, technically that is a change, but it's not a real change. And so what are we really trying to get at here? And I think the goal is that, you know, it's not every technical change, it's really the ones that are important to the nature of the work and the type of the work that someone is doing to qualify hours, I think.
So then if you're going to put in there, they change supervisors and they didn't send a training plan amendment, does that mean then that we would say, no, these hours don't count, because it says in there the supervisor, even if the supervisor would have been approved if they changed the training plan when they were supposed to? That's what I guess I'm not clear on.
That's a good question, Leslie.
I think there's opportunities to make some kind of discretionary language in here, which also complicates what you're saying to a large extent, because again, we're trying to offer flexibility so that we don't, you know, that we don't have to reject hours that really are good clinically supervised hours and under a good scope of work in this field. I mean, that's the intention. And unfortunately, because of the strictness of the language, we haven't. So is there a way to sort of blend in some of these pieces so that we have enough discretion to move forward, but still substantial issues could come in front of the board? The also bringing something in front of the board gives an opportunity for an appeal process for the applicant. And that would then allow the applicant more opportunity to say, wait a minute, here's what I did and how this played out. So I'm just trying to think of a language solution to what you're saying.
It seems like we're talking about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and we're trying to control for the spirit. I don't know that we can.
Well, we're also taking a little bit of personal responsibility away from the applicant. I mean, if I'm really working on my hours and I'm trying to do it, then I need to be the one that's putting in the amendments. And so we have got to be careful not to work harder than the applicant.
I hear that, and
Mhm.
I'll tell you, the times where we've had to deny someone's 2 years of experience are ones that I don't feel good about at the end of the day. I mean, those are, so I hear what you're saying, and I think personal accountability is important. And also, I didn't report my agency change, and it's 2 years of my work that is gone.
Mhm.
Even though it was well supervised community-based mental health work or whatever the case was, it was good clinical work and those were rejected. That's a heartbreaking scenario.
Yeah, I can see that too. I mean, it's the scope of practice. They're working within the field.
Yeah.
The agency may change, but they're still working in that same type of field. Yeah.
I also think it's important to remember that if for some reason the recommendation turns out to be awful and the board has a really terrible year and a half of trying to make this work, that they can just ask us to revisit it. Or we could make a recommendation to make a change back to what it was because it's too gray and it's not working. So even though it's written and it feels very final, it's not final. We can always recommend that it change back if we need to. I think giving flexibility because of all of the what if possibilities that are maybe out of the applicant's control, or maybe not out of their control, but things that are genuinely not about being careless, like my supervisor got fired and I just got a new one and I forgot to submit a change, or they left and I forgot. Giving the board some flexibility to say, well, you did forget, but that person is qualified and you did continue right away. And so you can count your hours. Don't do that again. Giving the board that flexibility, I think, is helpful.
So I'm going to ask another question and go way the other direction. If your goal is to allow people to count as many hours as they can, then why have the requirement? Why not say,
Well,
training plan amendments are recommended, and if you don't submit it for approval, it may not count when you apply for license?
yeah, I mean, it's a fair point, Leslie, to what David shared, which is people look wide-eyed at him that we have this in our regulation. And if it's something that we want to, if that's a recommendation, we can certainly consider that as well. I think that's the intent, again, behind that was, you don't want someone to get to the end of their 2 years and give some
Right.
practice that just didn't make sense and would have never counted for clinical work, right?
Right,
I mean, it's the other end of it.
right, exactly. But
If
then
we
it's
would
on the
that-
applicant. So if they didn't submit it, it was their choice not to do that, and now their hours don't count. At least then it doesn't feel like you're denying them for a technicality, even though they would have counted.
If we went to that change, which I'm not supportive of, if that makes sense. I would love to see more documentation submitted of hours at the end. Because right now it's the supervisor attestation. I don't know, I would almost want to beef that up a little bit. If there's no documentation of changes along the way, I would want to see more documentation at the end of the process.
Like what? What kind of documents?
Like, so I know that some supervisees that I have carried over their like hours counting process from their graduate program into their professional life. And so they still calculate their hours monthly or every other month, and they sign off on it and ask me to sign off on it. That's not a requirement. And y'all don't ask for that documentation, but if it was ever questioned, they have it. So I would almost want something like that, which in theory would show if there was a change in a supervisor or whatever as to who's signing off on something along the way.
And to add to what Jardine said too, I think it's important that we know that those hours are actually working. As you know, somebody could file a training plan and work in an agency for until they had part of their hours, and then maybe they decide just to do something different, but they're still in contact, but they're not actually providing therapy. I'm thinking of someone who asked me recently if they could count some of their volunteer work through hospice at a hospital, and if that would count for their hours. They weren't really working as a therapist. They were certainly providing an important service.
It sounds to me that there's it's maybe an argument to continue to think about is, do we have it at all? But what I sort of heard in comments is that leaves even more openness to what happens and how do we have good oversight of the candidates for clinical licensure. Is that what I heard sort of as the... Well, what's important in this conversation is that I'm able to share with the board when we meet what this advisory committee's temperature is on it. And then there's still enough time, believe it or not, even though it doesn't seem like it, to bring it back to this group and say, this is sort of where the board is landing on it. And can we get behind that if there's, you know, other ideas or things that come out of those discussions?
That would be helpful. If the
It may not
board
be
is
at the final
totally
point
freaked
yet.
out by, yeah, if they're totally freaked out by the idea of having flexibility, we could be responsive to that.
Yeah, you know, and I think about it like you said, Jardine, I think about it with my postgrads, and, you know, every time there's a change, I require them to copy me on the change that they're making to the board, so that we're just always in that mode of, you know, this is an informative process, but there are times where that doesn't happen, right? And someone forgets and doesn't do that. And yeah, good discussions though. Any other comments on this topic before we move on the agenda? Okay. Our next item of business then goes to the discussion of regulation on continuing education. I think we had some really good discussion at last meeting. Dave, do you want to take that?
Sure, and that is the regulation on continuing education requirements. It's KAR 102-5-10. And if you're looking at your minutes from the previous meeting, June 23rd, some of the discussion that happened at that meeting, I had done some research on what other states require for continuing education hours, and so that was revisited, and we are in alignment with the majority of states in terms of how many hours we require every 2 years, and so there was no change on that item. The advisory committee did recommend some changes to the language of the regulation, including basically some updating. Instead of viewing a videotape or listening to an audio tape, basically using the terminology video or audio recordings, removing a way to accrue continuing education hours using something called a self-directed learning project. As Leslie mentioned at the last meeting, that's not something that people really submit with any kind of frequency as a way to accrue those hours, and there's other categories where those types of things can already be covered. There was also a recommendation to modify the language for item 9 to preparing for and presenting for the first time or the substantial revision of the content for a marriage and family therapy course. So that is now in there as well, or you know, it would go before the board for the board to make a recommendation or change on that. But that was the recommendation from the advisory committee. The advisory committee also discussed the social work profession, considering adding an item for coaching or mentoring individuals getting ready to take the examination for licensing. And while there was good discussion on that, the advisory committee did not have a recommendation to add a similar item for your profession. So those were the items that we had noted in the minutes that were discussed in the recommended changes. And if there's any further discussion or changes, we can go ahead and make note of that now.
And did anyone have any further thoughts about that preparatory work for the exam?
I guess is my only question, having a license in this state is in another profession. Does that mean you keep it at a quarter an hour, 10 minutes, 5 minutes? Is it a minimum? I mean, I have a minimum where I am, so I'm just wondering, what is mentoring? Is it purposeful mentoring? Is it hallway conversations? Is it meeting in an office?
I think that was part of the discussion. It's what is it? What qualifies? What constitutes actual supervision to prep for an exam? I think ideally, probably all of us go to thinking about those testing for exams and doing maybe a group supervision carve out where you have some of that time in preparatory work. That's where our minds go. But if it's not prescripted, then maybe there would be opportunity for people to say, oh yeah, I got a question in the hallway and there's a 0.25 CEU,
Yeah, I think for the social work profession, one item that was added in combination was the way that they track that at the end of that period would be to have, I believe, a written document from the person who received that mentoring or coaching, basically attesting that they had received that from the person for a certain number of hours. So there is a kind of a check and way to verify it with that. But how that's all counted on a day-by-day basis or time frame by time frame, I don't know if it gets into that much in the details in terms of that.
sort of an interesting power differential in obtaining that documentation. Again, not that there'd be an abuse in there, but just something that came to mind as you were saying that.
I feel good about the recommendations we made last time.
Okay. And any other comments on that? We're holding fast with those.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you very much. The next item is on the documentation for continuing education.
Okay. And this is KAR 102-5-11, documentation for continuing education. Essentially, it's a companion regulation for the main continuing education regulation. It's a way to help licensees who are accruing the hours know what they need to have to demonstrate completion of those hours if they're selected for audit. And so at the last meeting, some of the discussion on this was on item B and C, add some language that would also allow a certificate of completion. For item I, basically it should be removed. That had to deal with the self-directed learning project. So if it's removed from the main one, the way to demonstrate those hours can also be removed. And then the last item was corresponding to what we talked about with updating the language from videotapes and audio tapes to video recordings and audio recordings. So those were the changes that were highlighted last time.
Yeah, I went back, David, to this, and it just even the beginning sentence of this piece where it says original signed form shall be accepted. I don't know if anyone here has received an originally signed form in a long, long time, but as we're going through looking at language changes, I think we probably should consider how we could rewrite that, which is just, I mean, we're essentially wanting proof of documentation, and that can come in many different formats. Mm-hmm. Electronically now, you'll get usually some emailed proof of attendance or completion. But is there a language change there we need to make in the first sentence?
We could just remove that piece and just any of the following forms of documentation shall be accepted.
Yeah, I agree, Jardine. I think that would make sense.
So to go ahead, original and signed. So say any of the following forms of documentation. Okay.
Any comments on that change? Okay.
I agree with that change as well.
Thanks, Nicole. Any other thoughts from our last meeting or with adding that? we're good with our original recommendations. Okay. Thank you very much. Next item, much bigger discussion, is the unprofessional conduct regulations.
And Mary, I think we're probably going to have enough time to cover this and the next topic, but I know the topic that's listed under new business is one that I think the board recently talked about, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for the advisory committee to discuss that item. So would you be open to kind of moving the order?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move to the new business item, which is discussion of members of other professions as board approved supervisors. So David, I'll let you kick off this conversation.
Okay. So we have included a copy of the regulation in KAR 102-5-7A. It's professional postgraduate supervised experience required for clinical marriage and family therapists. And under that regulation, under item C, it basically says the clinical supervisor of a person attaining the 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised professional experience required for licensure as a clinical marriage and family therapist at the time of providing supervision shall be a board-approved clinical supervisor and shall meet one of the following provisions. And the first talks about the person being a clinical marriage and family therapist who's licensed in Kansas, or licensed in another jurisdiction, who's engaged in the independent practice of clinical marriage and family therapy, including the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders for at least 2 years beyond the supervisor's registration, certification, or licensure date as a clinical marriage and family therapist. The second item states, under extenuating circumstances approved by the board, the clinical supervisor may be a person who is registered, certified, or licensed at the graduate level to practice in one of the behavioral sciences whose authorized scope of practice permits the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. A qualifying individual shall not have less than 2 years of professional experience in the independent practice of clinical marriage and family therapy beyond the date of the supervisor's registration, certification, or licensure. And the reason this topic has come up recently is that there have been requests that have been made to the BSRB for individuals to be able to receive supervision for someone who is from a supervisor who is not a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist, someone from another profession. And this language in the regulation basically says under extenuating circumstances approved by the board. And extenuating circumstances is a specific term. It does have a definition. And the definition for that term really calls for an extreme condition or event beyond the person's control that would prevent that person from essentially complying with what is required or would make it inadvisable for them to comply with what's required. So we have had some requests where someone was completely unavailable. And there's a circumstance where, let's say that you had someone providing supervision, and then that person passed away, or there was nobody else in that area. We have made changes in the last few years to allow for supervision to be by televideo, so that has really opened up the availability of different supervisors. But really, this language here that talks about extenuating circumstances really calls for an extreme reason why you would need to use someone outside of the marriage and family therapy profession. But we have had individuals who have requested to use someone from outside of the profession, and some of the reasons they have provided have involved financial reasons. You have certain employers who would like to make sure that someone receives clinical supervision, and the person that the employer would like to pay is not a clinical marriage and family therapist, but they would prefer to pay someone perhaps at their own location on their staff rather than pay someone from outside of that entity to provide the clinical supervision. And so the question that the agency and ultimately the board has been charged to kind of look at is, when you're evaluating these requests under the extenuating circumstances test, how should we look at those new types of requests that are based on things like financial factors. And ultimately too, if that is not something that would really fit the requirement and regulation, I guess the next question would be, is this still an appropriate test to use for these types of situations? Or is there a different type of test that would be preferred? If it's in here as an extenuating circumstance, we have to go by that definition and evaluate it accordingly. But I guess those are the two things that I think the board was wanting the advisory committees to discuss, and then to kind of collect feedback back from the different members of the advisory committees. So hopefully that frames it right. Leslie, is there anything that I missed as part of that framing for the conversation?
No, I don't think so. I think one thing that when we talked to Dave and I were talking about this the other day is we've now opened it up so you can do all your supervision by telehealth. However, that may make that person not able to move to another state. They will not. There are many states who do not allow televideo for supervision, and so their hours won't count if they want to move to another state, unless they, have been licensed long enough through reciprocity. But that's the one thing that I think kind of, muddies the water a little. So.
Yeah, because the old standard really looked at availability, and the board was asked to kind of gauge whether a supervisor was available and look at things like distance. And as Leslie mentioned, with it now being opened up to allow supervision by telehealth, it's a different type of situation. But also the language is specifically different. And so instead of looking at unavailability, it looks at, is it an extenuating circumstance? So that's also something we have to kind of weigh if it would fit under that. And I guess the other part of this conversation too is the value of having a supervisor specific to the marriage and family therapy profession, because the general guidelines would be that it would be someone who is licensed in that profession, and this would be an option to allow someone outside of the profession. So I guess another part of this conversation is the value of having someone specific to your profession providing that supervision.
I'll add, I know one of the other board members has talked to me a lot about just not having an adequate board approved supervisor network for the MFT body itself, and the difficulty in obtaining training that meets the board approved supervisors requirements for training. And so I've heard that from constituents about the difficulty in being able to do that in an easy way. I think the question, that Dave brought up as when we talked the other day was thinking about, MFTs as unique profession, and wanting that person who's getting their postgraduate supervised experience having that systems lens and for our profession, and yet also balancing out the adequacy of the network, if you will, in terms of being able to find enough supervisors who are board approved. So let's just open up for some discussion here.
I would be curious. Oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just going to say, I am hesitant to, I can see if, need 2 or 3 extra hours and you don't have, your supervisor's gone, certain amounts needing to be done by an outside person. But I think marriage and family is a unique perspective, and we do need that systems oriented person. And I think even having our code of ethics and being able to understand what it means to be a marriage and family therapist, I think that's part of why we look for a clinical supervisor in our field. I think telepsych has opened up quite a bit, and I know that there are people that have gone through trainings and weren't even able to get supervisees. So, there are people out there that will do that and have that experience. So I'm biased. I kind of like to keep us in our clinical field.
I have a question for that. I've been having discussions with this person who's getting ready to do a training plan. and she is an LMFT. And is it Bowen? Is that the theory? Okay. I want to make sure before I
One of them,
started it.
yeah.
She has an LSCSW. She wants to supervisor who is part of that. I mean, like high up in the, you know, actually has a part of the board or something like that, and has specialized in that. And so that's another type of question that we've gotten. Well, what about, or DBT? They focus on DBT at their site. So that's another type of
DBT.
extenuating circumstance that people are bringing forward.
DBT is a curriculum that anybody can take. Not necessarily have to be a marriage and family therapist to have that course. I mean, obviously, if they're Bowenian and they've taken that particular course, that's great. But what about the other, you know, systems point of view? So,
Well, conversely to that, Leslie, what I hear in that is, because these are discussions I've had with some of people lately who are graduating and asking for supervision. You know, people who need to specialize or want to specialize need to have a supervisor with experience. It's on, you know, that's on the attestation. So I have someone now who's an MFT, but is going to do hypnotherapy. And I said, I'm not your gal, you know, I'm not going to be able to supervise that practice because I don't have that training myself. And so there's both ends of this conversation. And as we're seeking to have a balance in there, I mean, I think that's what a lot of people are doing now, is specializing in post-grad work. And so, you know, being sensitive to that as well, too. Go ahead, Nicole.
I definitely hear what John is saying. I would wonder, though, about if we could make some adjustments to the language. I think I shared this scenario last time. I'm overseeing a postgrad right now who has practiced almost as long as me. So she's practiced, I think, almost 8 years. And she had clinical oversight at her other center because there was no other MFT available that was board certified to provide that supervision. And I just keep thinking as we sit together, and we have great supervision, but like sometimes I'm sitting there in our group and I'm like, she just has some of the best experiences that she's sharing. And it's such a bummer to me that she's not clinical yet, because she's got all the skills. She, you know what I mean? And she had oversight and supervision. And so I would wonder, with that exception, if we could change some language. And I know that I don't know what the lift would look like on this. And what I was going to say is I'm curious what some of the other professions are looking at, because I don't think this is unique to us. I know like professional counselors have the same struggle with finding supervisors. But yeah, I would wonder about changing some language on like, what could an exception request look like? I have reached out to so many people, or like we said, like there's nobody within this distance that can provide it. And yeah, and what would an exception request look like? And could we change some of that language on what those exceptions could be to make a request? Again, I know that would maybe involve another group of people to approve those. And so I know that that's where that kind of gets tricky also. I think that definition that you gave, David, even with that definition, I feel a little unclear on when that would apply in Kansas. So especially with telehealth being an option. But to Leslie's point, if you ever to move, different states may not recognize those supervised hours. And so I know that I did not provide a very clear recommendation there, but I would be curious what you all think about that.
Nicole, I'm curious, for this person, if you don't mind sharing, did they attempt to get their supervisor approved and they were denied?
That's what she has shared with me. Mm-hmm.
Okay, because it didn't meet the extenuating circumstances threshold.
I think
I
so.
imagine. Okay.
She said that she had reached out, and then also the person that was providing the supervision had reached out to the BSRB, and that's what they were told. Mm-hmm.
So
something that I've come across with professional counselors recently, we had a change in our agency where we provide supervision for free, but we don't have any LCPCs. and we had an LPC attempt to switch over to an in-house supervisor, and she was told that there was like a 60-mile radius that they were going by, that she could not have a non-LCPC if there was one within 60 miles of her, regardless of where, or a supervisor. And so I wonder if we could look at something like that, but I think probably 60 miles, it might be too big given our level of saturation across the state. And so I wonder about like 30-mile radius, like if you can't physically get to or find a supervisor that's willing to provide you with supervision, you know, in a 30 or 40-mile radius, then that could be something that might be part of an exception. I feel like John and have a really hard time with the idea of people being licensed as LMFTs but not being overseen by LMFTs, because my experience of seeing other professions in my work setting is that we do have really different lenses and really different understanding of systems theory and case conceptualization, all of those things that I think are lost. And so when we have someone who is doing or who gets approved as a clinical marriage and family therapist who's been trained by someone whose primary license is clinical social work, they're not having that same systemic relational focus as a provider. And so I worry about losing that. But I also understand that I live in some would say a city. And so my access to supervision and clinical supervisors is very different. My last point that I'll make, and then I'll stop talking, is that I wonder if we can make a directory of supervisors that get sent to new LMFT applicants. When you send them their congratulations, here's your license. If you want to do a training plan, here are all of the approved supervisors across the state that you could reach out to. I think that would be helpful.
We have that list available, but they have to sign a form saying they won't use it for the wrong, because it's an open record. They have to attest that they won't use it for the wrong reasons, like selling things or.
Okay.
Okay.
But
Chris,
that might be
quiet.
something we could
Go
add to the letter, that it's available if you do this, or, you know.
I like that.
Chris, I saw that you were wanting to make some comments here.
Yeah, I try with all these things to have an open mind. My knee-jerk reaction was no. I'm not excited about that for reasons that John and Jardine have mentioned. If I'm honest, though, Missouri, you can be about anything, and in terms of your background, and demonstrate some measure of training with systemic theory and be qualified as a supervisor. I just, from my own, I am absolutely biased. I've been part of training program and association, has worked hard to really defend this field as separate and distinct from others. And I am totally owning a bias about that I agree with what Jardine was saying, is there's just a difference that I'm really, I can sound snobby, which I don't like, but I just really am hesitant to do that. Now, in a larger circle to our earlier discussions today, this is why I think geography is important, because it's really easy for me in Kansas City to say this, because there's lots of supervisors around here. And if a person can't find a supervisor, they're not looking very hard, because there are a lot more here. Having supervised somebody that was out in the very western part of Kansas, where there's miles between light bulbs, it's a whole different kind of situation out there that I'm trying to, I wouldn't want my own bias to prevent people from having what they need. Leslie makes a good point about the Bowen thing, to which I'd want to say, you can be part of a Bowen group here, and maybe not have that be your supervision, but still be part of that community. But I'm really hesitant to open this up. That's just, I own that I'm biased about that, but just sharing.
Totally agree. I'm also, since we've made it supervision via telehealth available, I think that removes some of those barriers that are geographic. And I see also, being in a training program, see many times where licensed clinical social workers and things like that. Well, I've taken this course, or I've done that, but I just want to add my voice to the difference in lens and the difference in the ways of approaching therapy.
Do any of you, it was this way when I came on board. Social workers, you have to have social work supervisors. Psychology has to be psychology, master's level psychology has to be LMLP or a psychologist. Do you know why LPCs and LMFTs were allowed to have other supervisors? Was it just always that way? Or
I don't know why, Leslie, but if I'm going to put on my hypothetical brain, I'm going to say it was access. If you think about the field that was new, MFTs and LPCs were new. There were not enough supervisors to go around. And so I don't know, and I can't say that as fact, but that's certainly where I would think it came from.
Yeah. And you still don't feel you have enough to cover everybody?
I think you said we were at 130 maybe last time I checked. Does that number sound about right? I think the issue is coming up, and Jardine, you said this sort of in one of your comments. It's like for those who are agency based. So let's go back to thinking about workforce issues and those kind of things. The agencies are sort of scrambling to say, gosh, one of the things I can do is offer supervision to people as part of their training and employment package. But now I can't because this particular person's an MFT and I don't have an MFT here. And those are some of the things we're hearing. And I think it's important for us to hear that and still make a decision based on what the advisory committee thinks. But I do think there's a lot more of that coming up now. I do think I previewed this pretty good for you, David, saying I think there's going to be a strong sentiment that MFTs are MFTs and are proud of, as Chris said, that proud of that work. So I think that's where this is coming from. It's coming from not as much the telehealth access, because
you froze, Mary.
Yeah, I think Mary's frozen.
that it's that
I'm going to go on record saying Mary was just overwhelmed by the topic.
I'm having network adequacy issues myself. Sorry about that. I keep moving it towards the corner of the room, and hopefully the cement wall will hold me. Sorry about that. Anyway, short version, I think a lot of this is coming up from those employment type situations where they're trying to solve a problem of staff recruitment and retention.
Yes, we've had a lot of those lately.
Yeah.
And one of them even quoted the reg where it says you have to have an understanding of the agency policies and all of that, saying an outside supervisor wouldn't have that. Well, they could be trained to have that, but.
So at this point, to summarize, I'm hearing pretty clearly that this group, although Jim Godby, I didn't hear from you, is that we feel pretty strongly that we're not wanting to open up much in terms of what's already been evaluated as extenuating circumstances.
I also think we've already opened it up by not saying they have to be AAMFGs approved supervisors, so.
Oof, you would cut the playing field down a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Board approval is much different than AAMFT.
Right. So we've already expanded what a lot of states would require, so.
Jim Godby, do you have any comments for the meeting, this topic?
I agree with what everything you were saying, and I didn't want to bring up the area thing again, but I think it did come up with the whole thing with trying to supervise or have supervision in Western Kansas, that's that's an issue that they deal with, but I think it can be overcome. And I don't think the marketing type of thing is to the point sometimes there are places in Western Kansas they don't have access. So
Well,
I mean, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I really appreciate all of your thoughtful conversation on this. I did talk to Mary ahead of time, and we had a little conversation first, but I mentioned to Mary, one of the things is my specific background is not in any of the mental health professions that we regulate. And so on one hand, it's helpful to be able to shift back and forth when having the different advisory committees for social work, for marriage and family therapy, or psychology. But on the other hand, in terms of the items that are specific to your profession, it is helpful to hear from all of you in terms of the value of having someone provide supervision who is a marriage and family therapist or who is trained in that area and knowledgeable and educated in that area. And so I appreciate all your comments and feedback on this topic.
Leslie, could we look at adding the information about approved supervisors? It's available to the LMFT letter that goes out when you approve an application.
Yeah, I made a note to look at the original license letter because there's a paragraph that talks about being under direction. So we could add in there when when you want to submit a training plan, you can get a list of supervisors by contacting us.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the discussion here. We have running short on time, but some time if we want to look at the unprofessional conduct regulation attachment in there. And David, do you want to say anything about this document?
Yeah, just for those of you that have been on the advisory committee, that last year each of the different advisory committees were asked to look at your unprofessional conduct regulations, and for the BSRB there is a separate unprofessional conduct regulation for each of the professions. There are some similarities, but they're not identical, and they do have different items that they have had as it's been created and added to over the years. But for some of those, they had not been reviewed in quite some time. So each of the advisory committees went through their profession-specific regulation and identified proposed changes to the regulation. Those were forwarded to the board for consideration. The board went ahead and combined all of the proposed changes from the advisory committees and had those sent back together to each of the advisory committees. So that way, what your advisory committee recommended, but now you can see all of the different proposed changes from the other advisory committees. And you can look at those to be able to say, was there a proposed change from the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee that's helpful to bring over to the Marriage and Family Therapy list of proposed changes? Or is there something from the social work conversation they had in their advisory committee that's helpful to bring over? So in your packet of material, you have a 42-page document. It's lengthy, but it basically is each of the other professions and professional conduct regulations with their proposed changes. The goal is by the end of this calendar year to have these changes forwarded back to the board. So the board can really take action on any changes to the regulations. But we had asked you to review all of this information and then be prepared to have a discussion at this meeting if there's any items you saw for other professions you think would be suitable to bring over to your list of proposed changes.
Okay, so did this group have time to review the document in advance so that we could be prepared for that discussion? My thoughts are if we had, I know our goal is to do this before the end of the year, and we want to make sure that the board has opportunity to look at all those changes. But if you haven't had an opportunity to read through it or look at what you like from the other professions, I don't want to have a conversation if we're not kind of prepared to do that. I know we had gone through ours, but maybe not in this method where we're looking at the other professions have done.
I would be in favor of more time to review the comparison changes.
Yeah, if
Okay.
we could then, if you could have recommendations or thoughts for the next meeting, then we'd still, David, remind me, we'd still have one more board meeting. Is that correct? Okay. To think
Yeah.
about my calendar for a minute,
Yeah.
so that we'd be able to give those to the group. I imagine at the board retreat, we'll have some discussion as well. So there would be then even additional information we could bring back to this, which will be after, that will be after our, yes, okay, I did it. I got my dates in mind.
Yeah. Your
Because
next
our next
meeting-
advisory meeting would be the 13th of October, and we could really have those fresh and ready for the board retreat.
Correct. Yeah, the retreat is scheduled for October 23rd. And then there's a regular board meeting that's the second Monday in November. So the board would really have a couple of opportunities to revisit these as long as you had kind of talked about them at your next meeting. Now, with that said, as you made recommendations for new members or a new member at this meeting, the annual training will probably take place at the next meeting, and that does take a good hour. So so your discussion on the unprofessional conduct regulations probably needs to be pretty targeted to make sure that you can take care of any other items you need to. But yeah, it should be fine. We can kind of discuss these items at the next meeting in October.
Okay, great note for us too, because we will have our annual training and then new training for the advisory member. So we'd have to be pretty succinct in our comments with this. So thank you for that reminder. Sounds good to me. We'll make that adjustment, and yeah, we might find some interesting language in some of the other professions' work that we might be interested in incorporating.
And I will say this too, if something does strike you and it's not included in the other ones, but you still see something that is just a logical modification, we can still take a change that had not been brought over from another profession. It's just those are the ones that are easy to see because their regulations are structured similar to yours. But if you do see something that's just not quite in any one specifically, but you still think would be helpful, that can still be considered too.
Any other business items to discuss?
This is kind of under the item for the next meeting. But I know it can be helpful for some of you to get dates on your calendars in advance. And so if you don't mind taking a look into next calendar year, perhaps at the next meeting, we can start to discuss meeting dates for meetings next year, such as for the February meeting, April meeting, and start to get those on the calendar. So if you start looking ahead to your calendars in preparation for that, that would be helpful.
Good reminder, because we know how calendars work. I don't have a formal agenda item, but I'm making an assumption that many of you receive newsletter items from AAMFT. And of interest, there was an article about California and moving forward with a portability group. And so I think this is, in my mind, although I haven't read it thoroughly, so please understand that the precursor to interstate compact for AAMFT in our work. So I just wanted to point that out to you. If you haven't seen that, it came out, I believe, this week. And I think it's important for us to keep those things on our radar as the other licensed professionals are having interstate compacts more and more, and we're hearing more of that, for us to stay on top of that as that comes our way.
Something I'd like to add for a future agenda item, I think, is probably what it would be. So the way that our licensing and training plan dates overlap, it often requires LMFTs who are at the end of their training plan to renew their LMFT and then 60 to 90 days later pay for an LCMFT application process. And that can be a financial burden for folks. And if you choose not to renew right away, then it can be a professional limitation for you. And I don't know that I have a solution at this point. I just I happen to be supervising people who are trying to triple up on supervision because they want to be done around the same time. And I'm like, there's no way we're doing that. I don't have time for that. But that's something that I think has come up, and I think I even experienced it when I'm thinking back to my own training plan. And it's just because you get licensed and then 30 to 60 days later you start a training plan. Well, now you're on a 2-year timeline for that when your 2-year LMFT started 2 months ago. So I don't know if there's a solution, but I would love for us to just be thinking about how we maybe could help with that.
That is on my mind too, Jardine, because I've been in those same situations with those transitioning into another license. So I'm happy to put that on a discussion point for another meeting. I think it's a great discussion. Yeah, and I would just say, if any of you ever have suggested topics like that, even between meetings, you can email Dave and I, and we'll make sure to get it on the agenda. Don't let the formality of this meeting be in the way of something you want to bring up to this committee, because we'll be glad to put it on the agenda as a talking item. Okay, any other items for today's meeting? Well, I hope you all stay cool. I don't know where it is in your land, but today's heat index in Wichita is going to be like in the 110 range again. So we enjoyed the break while we can. But there's no other business. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you all so much. I will see you in October.
Thank you.